that we know how to solve quadratics, and we're going to put them all together today and go over them. So we started on Tuesday after you guys took the quiz. We started working on solving these by taking square root of both sides. So the way you know you can do this method is if you only have one x in the problem. Okay? So, like, for example, in example 5 here, x is only written one time there. I don't have an x squared and an x. I just have an x. So a problem like this, we can solve like an equation, and it's going to be easiest to solve it like you would a regular sort of math 1 equation. Now, this is a rather complicated problem here because we have lots of stuff going on. But we want to try to get that x right there by itself. And so if we're trying to get that x by itself, we want to start furthest away from the x. So what should we try to move first? The 9. The 9's got to be subtracted. So we're going to subtract 9 from both sides. Since those are both negative, you're really adding there, so you'll get 5. Negative 75 equals negative 3 times x plus 2 squared. Okay, questions? All right, so after we subtract the 9, what's the next thing we got to get rid of? The exponent, or what else is on the outside of those parentheses? That negative 3, right? You actually want to get rid of the negative 3 before the exponent. When you're solving equations, it's kind of like the opposite of order of operations. Normally, we would do exponents before we would multiply by that negative 3, so now we got to divide by the negative 3 before we get rid of the exponent. So we want to divide both sides by negative 3 because that negative 3 is multiplied by that parentheses. So it's going to give us a positive 25 equals x plus 2 squared. Okay, so still trying to get that x by itself. Next thing we need to get rid of is that square. To undo a square, what do? Square root. Okay, the opposite of a square is a square root. So we square root both sides of the equation. What is the square root of 25? 5 equals x plus 2. What do I have to put with that 5 right there? Plus or minus, because when you take the square root of both sides, you must put the plus or minus there. And so the last thing you're going to do is subtract this 2, but be careful here. You can't subtract the 2 from a plus or minus 5. All right, so what you need to do is just write it like this, negative 2 plus or minus 5. And then you need to find these answers. So you've got negative 2 plus 5, which would give you 3. So there's one of your answers. And you would have x equals negative 2 minus 5, which would give you negative 7. So there's your other answer. Not all, but most of these problems end up with 2 answers. So whenever you're doing these problems and you get to the bottom, normally you're going to have 2 answers. We'll talk about, when we get a little more into this, we'll talk about which ones do and which ones don't have 2 answers. Okay, questions? All right, this is a method you can use when you just have a single x. Okay. All right, our next method that we're going to do is we have spent a lot of time factoring, and you guys had a quiz on that on Tuesday. So we need to see why we're doing that and what we can use it for. So if I have an equation like x squared plus 7x minus 18 equals 0, you guys learned yesterday you could use quadratic formula, because you can use quadratic formula on any quadratic, period. So quadratic formula will work, but let's say that I give you this problem and it's on a calculator inactive section. So when you do that, you've got to do 7 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 18. And you got to get all that done by hand without a calculator. So that's not really the easiest in the world to do. It's not impossible, but it's not the easiest. So if something will factor, factoring is going to be the quickest way to solve the problem. So when I see x squared plus 7x minus 18, the first thing I usually try to do is I try to factor it. So I know I would have x and x. I've got negative 18, so for negative 18 I could use negative 9 and 2, I could use negative 18 and 1, I could use negative 6 and 3. Which one of those could give me that positive 7? The 9 and 2. And which one should be negative, the 9 or the 2? The 2. So I'll have negative 2, positive 9. And you can check to make sure that that works. Now, whenever you do this, we were just factoring earlier, so we didn't have an equation. We didn't have an equal 0. Right now, we're not done, okay? Negative 2 and 9 are not our answers, because if we plug in negative 2 and 9, they do not give us 0, okay? What we're going to do right now is we're going to use what's called the zero product property. Zero product property. And the zero product property is something that you learned a really long time ago. You just probably don't remember that that's what it's called. Zero product property tells you anything times 0 equals what? 0, right? So in order for this to equal 0 here, either x minus 2 or x plus 9 has to be 0, right? So whenever we're solving by factoring, we're going to take each one of our factors, so x minus 2, and set it equal to 0. And we're going to take x plus 9, and we're going to set it equal to 0. A lot of kids don't even like to write that part down. They like to go straight to the answers, which is fine. So if we move this 2 over, x equals 2, and if we subtract that 9, x equals negative 9. And you can really do that part in your head if you want, and that's perfectly fine with me if you do, because if you think to yourself, what right here would give me 0? 2 minus 2 would be 0, right? And if you think, what right here would give me 0? Negative 9 plus 9 would give me 0. Now the trick to solving by factoring, just like with quadratic formula, this has to equal, the equation has to equal 0 before you can start factoring. So on number 7, we can't solve this one right away. So go ahead and copy 7 down for me, but it's not quite ready to solve yet. Okay, so whenever we have one like this, you always have to move everything to one side or the other first. On this problem, even though you've got to move more stuff, I would take this 7x and the negative 6 and move it over here. The reason is it's difficult to factor if your x squared is negative. So it's better to keep your x squared positive. So I would say 0 equals x squared. When you move that 7x over to the other side, it's going to become a negative 7x. And when you move that negative 6 over to the other side, you get a positive 6. Okay, so you must do that before you start factoring. Thank you. Oh, if you have food in here, please go throw it away outside in one of the big trash cans out here. Yeah. So if you got, I mean, it's fine to throw away, papers or something that's empty, but anything that had liquid in it, just go ahead and throw it away out there. Or anything that's still got some food in it, go throw it away out there. Especially if Miss Aileen's already taken up our trash. It's going to sit here all weekend until she comes again Monday, and it's going to stink. So several of you come in with food, that's fine, but go out in the hall and throw it away. Yeah. You can. If you want to do that instead, you have negative x squared plus 7x minus 6 equals 0. And then if you just multiply through by negative 1, divide by negative 1, whichever way you want to think about it, you'll get x squared minus 7x plus 6 equals 0. So that's perfectly fine as well. Yeah. So we're going to factor this. On the worksheet you're going to have today, it's going to tell you which method I want you to use. But whenever we get to test time here, it's going to have some of them where I tell you what method to use, but some of them you're going to just get to choose what you want to do. I always try to factor first, especially if it doesn't look too scary like this one, because factoring is quickest if you can do it. And then if it doesn't work, you can use quadratic formulas. So here we would need a negative 6 and a negative 1. But remember, negative 6 and negative 1 are not our answers. We've got to say x minus 6 equals 0, which means x would equal 6. And we've got to say x minus 1 equals 0, so x would equal 1. So 1 and 6 are our answers here. All right, questions? All right, I'm going to skip a little bit of the quadratic formula stuff. I'm going to skip here to example 10. Because you guys probably did one like this yesterday, but now, really, it would be in your best interest here just to divide everything by 2 right from the beginning. But because I want to show you something about simplifying your final answer, I'm not going to do that for this problem. Okay? So maybe you didn't recognize that it would all divide by 2, or maybe you just didn't want to. But let's say we don't divide all this by 2. You can move stuff to either side. I'm going to move everything over here. I just like for that x squared to be positive. Even for quadratic formula, I kind of like for it to be positive. It really doesn't matter whether or not it's positive for quadratic formula. But here I'll get 2x squared minus 10x minus 20. Now that really kind of looks like it'll factor. The numbers aren't very big or scary, but if we tried, we're not going to get it to factor. So let's go ahead and do quadratic formula. Like I said, really you should divide by 2, but just because I want to show you something on reducing these, I'm not going to right now. So we would have x equals opposite of b, which would be positive 10, plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, I was hoping somebody would ask that question. It really should be negative 10 squared, but I never put the negative there. Why would I never put the negative there? It doesn't matter. When you square it, it's going to be positive anyway, right? So I never put it there because Your calculator, there's some of you all think it's your best friend. Some of you are terribly dependent upon it. Whenever I was, several years ago, gosh, I doubt you guys were probably in early elementary school whenever I had him. I'm getting old. But several years ago, I had an exchange student from South Korea named Woo. And so I had a exchange student from South Korea, and he was really pretty cool because, like, whenever he came to our school, we really didn't know. His English was not very good at all, so we really didn't know what he could do. So they put him in, like, Foundations of Math 1, or the equivalent at the time. We didn't teach Math 1 at the time, but it was like Foundations of Math 1. So they put him in that class, and then they realized, hey, this kid is really good at math. He just can't speak English very well. So they let him skip all of the other maths and go to pre-calculus the next year because he was way out of place with those lowest level kids. So they let him skip Math 1, Math 2, and Math 3 and go straight to pre-cal. So I had him in pre-cal, and teaching him was really neat because he said that in Korea that, like, they would really drill them on being really fast and really good without a calculator. Like, he would tell me, like, these shortcut rules, like if your B is even on a quadratic formula equation, you can use this other equation, and then you don't have to simplify as much, like all kinds of crazy stuff that they do in Korea. And he never, ever would touch a calculator. Ever. Like, I would have to make him go get a calculator when we were doing trig, because you really couldn't do the trig without a calculator at all. But he would never use a calculator. If he had, I could make numbers twice as big, and he would still never use a calculator. And he was pretty fast without the calculator. But one little girl that sat beside him, bless her heart, she might not should have been in pre-cal. She was the opposite of Woo, and she was really struggling. She would talk about her calculator, how she loved her calculator. It was the best thing. If I ever gave him something without a calculator, she'd whine about it the whole time. And Woo sat beside her, and Woo said, "The calculator is that's not Russian voice. That's not the right voice. Calculator is dumb. In Korea, calculator is cheating." He would say, like, they would get in trouble if they were using a calculator in the math class in there. So this is one of the reasons why the calculator is dumb. Woo is right. That's a long story to tell you this. If you type in -10 squared, what's the calculator tell you it is? -100. It is not -100. Because you have to type in parentheses -10, you have to close the parentheses, and then you have to square it. Alright? So, that is correct. This is not. But if you're in a hurry, you type it in wrong. Or if you do this, if you do -10, and you hit the square before you close your parentheses, it's going to do it wrong. So I just always leave it off. Because it doesn't make a difference, because I know that when I square something, it's positive. So I just leave that negative off altogether. It keeps me from typing that in wrong whenever I'm working something really quickly. So we must be smarter, or let's say this, often kids will argue with me that the calculator told them that their answer was right, so it must be right. And whenever they do that, I will tell them that the calculator is only as smart as the person operating the calculator. The calculator can't solve a problem. It can only do what you told it to do, right? So if you told it to do the wrong thing, it can't do it. So be careful with that calculator. I go ahead and put that +10 there for that reason. You don't have to, but you need to know that that's a positive number right there. So we get x equals 10 plus or minus. We can go ahead and do this on our calculator. So we'll have 10 squared minus 4 times 2 times -20. So plus or minus square root of 260 all over 4. Now, a number like 260, I bet will break down. So what do you think might go into 260? Say 4 goes. 4 and 65. 65 won't break down. We saw that in the warm-up this morning. So So if I've got square root of 260, and that is square root of 4 times 65, that means I've got 2 times the square root of 65. So I've got x equals 10 plus or minus 2 square root of 65 all over 4. Now let me show you something here. This will reduce, but you have to be really, really careful. In order for this to reduce, 10, 2, and 4 all have to be divisible by the same number. Everybody always skips 2 right here. They ignore it right there. So all 3 of those have to be divisible. They are divisible by 2, so you can reduce here. But it has to be all 3 of those numbers. If it's not all 3, you can't reduce. Because 4 has to reduce with the 10 and with the 4. So this is going to be 5 plus or minus the square root of 65 all over 2. I didn't put a 1 there in front of the square root of 65 because it's unnecessary, but you could if you want. Now, all of this could have been avoided if we divided by 2 at the very beginning, which I didn't let you do because I wanted to make sure that we went over this together. All right, questions? All right. Did you guys do any yesterday where you got no real answers? Okay, all right. So, how do you know that you get no real answers? Aaliyah? Negative number under the square root. So I have one example of that, but we won't do it because you guys went over it yesterday. Now, sometimes you do legitimately get a negative under the square root. It's not because you squared your negative wrong. So if you get a negative under the square root, for right now, we're going to call that no real answer because there aren't any real answers for that. But on Monday, we're actually going to learn a way we can kind of deal with those answers. So, but for right now, we're not going to do it. All right. Okay, here is the last thing that we're going to do. So, quadratic equations have one solution, 2 solutions, or no real solutions. So for these problems, that's what I'm asking. I don't want you to solve the whole problem. I just want to know whether there's 1, 2, or no real solutions. Okay, did you guys do this yesterday? Okay, good. Even though you didn't do it yesterday, but really if we put together everything you did on that worksheet, you kind of did do it yesterday. Because Aaliyah just told me that if I got no real answers, or no real solutions, how did you know that it was going to be no real solutions, Aaliyah? Negative under the square root, right? There was a problem that we did whenever we were going over the homework where we only got one answer. I think it was -5 was our answer. What did we have under the square root for that? 0, right? So 1 real solution. That tells us that you have a 0 under the square root. And so what do you think is going to give you 2 solutions? Positive number under the square root. So if the question only asks us whether we have 1, 2, or no real solutions, we don't have to look at the whole thing. We can just look at what's under the square root. So, Adam, you got a question? You're going to do the first one for me.
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay, so on that first one, what would we do?
You would just act like, normal quadratic, you get x equals -6 plus or minus 6 squared minus -4 times 1 times 9. And all that over 2.
Good.
And then in the square root, you get 6 squared equals 36.
Mm-hmm.
But then also -4 times 1 times 9 also equals 36.
Good.
So you're going to get 0. And when you get 0 in your square root, that means you're going to get 1 real solution.
Very good. So if all they're asking for here is 1 or none, you just say 1. When you see that 0, underneath that square root, that tells you one solution. Because if you add 0 or subtract 0, you get the same number, right? So really, all you got to look at is this part underneath the square root. If you get 0, it's only one real solution. So if we look at number 13 here, and all we care about this time is whether it's got 1, 2, or no solutions, right? The first thing I would have to do is I'd have to move that x over to the other side. So I'd have 4x squared plus x plus 5 equals 0. Make sure you put it in the right spot so that you got your A, B, and C. And then all I really need to know is that b squared minus 4ac part, right? I could write the whole thing, or I could just do b squared, so 1 squared minus 4 times a, which is 4, and c, which is 5. So I get 1 minus, let's see, 16 times 5 is going to be 80. Is that right? And that gives me negative 79. So when I get a negative, this would all be under the square root if it were in the quadratic formula. What do I have?
That means you have
No real solutions. And we're actually, on Monday, going to learn what to do when we have no real solutions, because we can do something with them. All right, 14 is our last one. So on this one, I would move that 2x squared to the other side, 2x squared plus 9x minus 3. And so we've really only got to look at that b squared minus 4ac. So 9 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 3. And let's say maybe this is calculator inactive. I know this is going to be 81, and this is not too bad to do. So you'd have negative 8 times negative 3, which would give you positive 24. But let's say the numbers were worse. When I've got that negative here times that other negative here, I know I'll get a positive. So I know I get a positive number. So right now, if you wanted, you could stop, because you know you're going to get a positive number under the square root. So this is 2 real solutions.